This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Martha Biondi, Lorraine H. Morton Professor of Black Studies at Northwestern University. She is the author of To Stand and Fight, The Struggle for Civil Rights in Postwar New York City, published by Harvard University Press in 2003, The Black Revolution on Campus, published by University of California Press in 2014, and a forthcoming book on Black internationalism. In this conversation, we discuss the origins of Black studies as a field, the place of historical study in the field, and what questions remain to be asked, explored, and debated in a moment of political crisis. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast, Martha. It's good to see you.
Hi, John. It's great to be here. Thank you.
So I'm really excited to have a chance to talk to you about your thoughts on the field of Black studies, its past, present, and future. Just generally, I really love your work, but also because your work is really at the heart of what this podcast is thinking about and talking about across all of these conversations, which is about the origins of the field and where it's going. So for me, this is a little bit extra special. I think you'll have some insights that few of us in the field actually have, having worked on those student revolutions and uprisings that made this field a field. But before we get started, I actually wanted to open with a question that's really just an invitation for you to narrate a bit of your intellectual journey around this question of your scholarly work on and concern with Black life. Just curious what drew you to these kinds of questions that animate the field of Black studies. Obviously, you're an historian as well, but an historian working in Black studies on Black life. What drew you to those questions, and what sustains that interest for you across these years of writing and teaching?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be in conversation with you, and congratulations on this wonderful podcast. I kind of see myself as a scholar of Black political thought and related social movements and organizing. And I think I got, my interest in this is very, I really date from my childhood. It's very old and longstanding. And I would probably say it has an intellectual or educational origin and a political origin. So first, with the political origin, I was, ever since I was a kid, I gravitated toward news, watching Sunday morning talk shows rather than cartoons, and coming home from school and wanting to read the newspaper. So I was and I think it's because when I look back, it's because, this was the 70s. And I think it was because those epic social movements of the 60s were really percolating very much into the public sphere and very much into politics. And so, I really felt the power of the Black liberation movement, of the women's liberation movement, of the anti-war movement. And, I grew up in a very rural kind of white part of Connecticut. But I remember watching as a kid, Black public affairs shows coming out of both Hartford and New York City, and just feeling like the conversations on these programs were like the vital issues of the day. So in some ways, my earliest sort of memory in some ways of kind of, let's just call it like Black, public affairs discourse or discussions was sort of addressing what seemed to me fundamental issues of fairness, justice, democracy. And so that was very compelling to me. So then that, I think those interests got reinforced in educational exposure. Certainly in high school and courses, certain teachers were very socially conscious. And again, I think it was the 70s. There was more of I think it just willingness. People didn't self-censor. It was just, kind of all of these issues were in the room. And I really was fortunate, I guess, to have great socially engaged teachers. And so, that exposure really intensified in high school and then in college. And when I went to college, my intention was to graduate and hopefully go to law school and become some kind of civil rights lawyer, kind of, public interest lawyer. That was my long kind of career interest since childhood. Then I got to college, and in college, I would say a kind of budding activism that I always felt, kind of began to grow. It was during the period of the anti-apartheid movement, the divestment movement. And so I was very involved in that on my campus, got arrested at the consulate in New York City. I went to college in New York at Barnard, and then went to Columbia after that. And so, I started taking history classes, and I took classes with Eric Foner, who later went on to be my PhD advisor. And I think it was very interesting because Eric's, a kind of scholar of many things, but, primarily kind of the 19th century and the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so it's odd, looking back, that courses in 19th century U.S. history felt, as they say in Black Studies, relevant, right? It's like the quest for sort of relevance, which is at the heart of how people articulate the mission, the intellectual and social mission of Black Studies. And I think I just felt that in those 19th century, because he just really infused African-American history. And he didn't call it that. I didn't know that's what I was studying, but it certainly was what I was studying. And, for all the papers, when I look back on the paper topics in college, it was like Marcus Garvey, Souls of Black Folk, slavery, all kinds of stuff on that. So kind of that's what I was doing without really knowing it. And I think toward the end of college, I kind of went through a bit of an intellectual crisis, or like, what am I going to do? Am I going to go to law school? And Eric was actually encouraging me to go to a PhD program, and I didn't even really know what that meant. I mean, I had never thought of becoming a professor. I'd never imagined that kind of life for myself. But I think that encouragement was effective. And so I did. I applied, and I took a year off and taught high school social studies in between, and then went to grad school. And I think that, my dissertation was on, the topic that became my first book, To Stand and Fight, on the civil rights movement in New York City in the 1940s and 1950s. And I think that, I think I revisited the conversation during grad school of like, do I really want this life? It's like, it's hard when you're a grad student, and then it continues when you're an assistant professor, and you don't really necessarily feel like your work is having an impact or that you're in any vital discussions. You're kind of in your silo, you're in the library, you're by yourself reading a lot of books. And that didn't really feel like what I wanted. And so I think I was sustained at that time by the issues I was researching and writing about, and they felt very important, right? And I was, working on this, I guess it was when it was a book, but like there were all these kind of galvanizing, cases in New York City of police violence and police murder. And I was sort of looking at the historical roots of that. And I think that that sort of sustained me and made me feel like, okay, one day I will feel the importance of this or the contribution of it. But, you can really feel like you're just, kind of, in a very secluded away in the ivory tower at various points. So that was kind of my journey.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think we're, if not about the same age, definitely same generation. It's really hard to explain to people who weren't sort of alive and aware in the 1970s and early 1980s, just how different something like the news was. The way the news was like an event, right? You tuned in and there was outrage and, but it wasn't absorbed with all the talk, the panels and so forth. And we can debate the pros and cons of all that. But I know that, and then the anti-apartheid struggle. It's funny to hear you talk about this. It wasn't my particular journey through doctoral studies, but so many concerns animated by those same things. I think for our generation, television just functions so differently. Even just culturally, like what television looked like. We've in some ways taken huge steps backward. And I'm not in the olden days, everything was great, but like how you could tune in and they were talking about percolating social revolutions. That changes how you anticipate so much about the world.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you, and this is, obviously draws on a lot of your previous writing, in terms of the sort of framing of the question, but I wonder how you imagine the field, or sort of how you think about the field of Black studies in a maybe in a normative register, because it has this interesting double origin, right? It is generated in this moment of student and community uprising in the wake of the civil rights movement and the Black Power, Black Panther movements. And so it had this intense political urgency to it. But it was also the birth of the institutionalization and therefore expansion and study of the Black intellectual tradition. So it has this sort of twin origin, and I want to say twin rather than opposed because they have a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences of this intense political urgency at the founding of Black studies, but also the urgency of exploring, establishing, and expanding this thing called the Black intellectual tradition. And so I wonder for you, having worked in the field and having written on similar kinds of issues, how you imagine Black studies, both as a field in the present, but also going forward in relation to these two imperatives.
I couldn't possibly articulate my own, vision of what I think it ought to or should be. I mean, I think as a historian, I mostly try and, let me back up. I mean, I just agree with what you said, and I'm glad you didn't oppose those two kind of aspects of Black studies, because I think that they've been been incredibly important for us to see them together and not try to evacuate one or the other. And so, it's frustrating when people try and polarize that and say, well, we're an academic unit and we can't have our eyes focused on organizing or student activism or, these sort of issues take us away from a primary responsibility. Or there might be people who say, we're just excessively academic and, this is not what we're, not the origins, and we should all be out there in the streets. And if we're not, then we're somehow failing. And I feel like both of those readings or of those critiques, I think, do a disservice to, I think, this very much dual character of the field that you just identified. And I think that dual character is still very much alive. And it takes different forms, and people may not always understand it to be activism. But for example, at Northwestern, this isn't coming specifically out of Black Studies, but a lot of the Black Studies faculty are faculty in our prison education program. Mm-hmm. Now, somebody might not view that as quote unquote activism, but I mean, to me, that very much the spread of these prison education programs and their, I think the key role of many people coming out of Black Studies, I think does continue that tradition and speak to our hunger for have different kinds of engagements and in different ways to use our knowledge and to disseminate our knowledge. Mm-hmm. And you could really look around and see lots of examples of that in different universities. I mean, at UIC, a lot of the people in Black Studies created a social justice initiative, Barbara Ransby, for example. And that's a way, I think, of being relevant, of giving back, of kind of, trying to bring academics from Black Studies and other disciplines into a kind of social justice sphere and dialogue and, open up the university to these, outside kind of co-strugglers in a way that the founders of Black Studies really wanted to do. They wanted to make the campus part of the movement and, mm-hmm. and take the resources of the campus and make them available, right, to movement organizers. And I think that we still try and do that in a variety of different ways today. And we don't often sort of hold it up and identify it and call attention mm-hmm. to it, but mm-hmm. or connect it to that tradition. But I do think it's happening. And then on the intellectual tip, I mean, that's, I think that's sort of uncontested, like the extraordinary scholarship that scholars in Black Studies have produced over the last decades, game-changing, award-winning, and it has shaped and reshaped and contributed to so many other fields and disciplines.
Yeah, and I think about, part of this, the genesis of this question is that debate in the Dispatches volume between Marable and Gates. I mean, very staged, but about, what ought Black Studies be primarily concerned with. One thing that strikes me about the last 5 to 10 years is thinking about intellectual traditions as somehow apolitical seems really hard to sustain in a moment when, you can't even talk about slavery in high schools in many places, all of a sudden that intellectual traditions this may be more political than we in our tiny academic bubble often see it.
Yeah, and I think our grad students really just get that. I don't think that they pose this as a binary. I think that they fully see how political the work is, the intellectual work, the academic work. But I also appreciate how they don't feel torn in terms of the directions they choose. Like they feel very supported and comfortable in pursuing, I think, careers that as an academic, as a scholar, that are sort of deeply engaged in social justice work in a broad variety of ways. So absolutely.
I mean, reading and revolution at some point come together. So hopefully we could situate these kinds of things in between. So let me ask about your work and how you think about it in relation to the field of Black studies. I mean, you're, as you said, you're an historian, and so you have a particular set of concerns. And so I'm interested to hear you talk about that, and in particular, how you think it relates to what Black studies has done and what kinds of questions and things that it should be doing, right? In other words, how do you think that your writing is expanding or pushing the boundaries of the field?
Well, I'm always reluctant to sort of say how any entity or initiative, what it ought to be doing or should be doing.
Sure.
I don't think that's my place or anyone's place, really. I mean, we just find a way to contribute. We find a way to be our best, do our best, and do work that we think matters or is, makes a contribution or is in some way important. And so that's kind of how I look at it. I think that, I've always, like I was kind of saying earlier, kind of seen Black thought, kind of Black history, Black organizing as kind of an archive of resistance, an archive of, that points us to critical inquiry, whether it's around racial capitalism, again, the Constitution, the key questions in the nation and in the world. And I think for me, a lot of my scholarship has been focused on, in some ways, elevating certain voices and innovations of what you might call the Black left. And I think that when I was coming up, there was, kind of getting educated, Black political thought and kind of resistance was framed as a binary between kind of like civil rights liberalism and maybe Black nationalism. So for me, that always felt sort of inadequate. And I think that a lot of my, my first book, my second, currently the one I'm working on now, is to sort of broaden that narrative and open up space for sort of, kind of Black left thinking and thought. And, my current project is looking at kind of internationalism, left internationalism, Black internationalism from the 60s through the 90s, and looking at, contributions and innovations in terms of impacting U.S. policy, but also impacting Southern Africa as well. So that's what I'm working on now.
Yes, is it out anytime soon, or is this in
about a year? The book should come out. I finished writing it, so it should come out in about a year.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait. So I'm sure many people listening feel the same way. And it's amazing when you're finished writing a book, how long it does take to come out.
Yeah.
makes it strange when it comes out. It's a little bit
you want to celebrate right away, but you can't.
It's like, this thing that I wrote and I put behind me a year ago. So, anyway, also this is a sort of companion question in some ways. Obviously you're appointed in a Department of Black Studies, formerly a Department of African American Studies, also with a companion appointment in history. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I think is always interesting to hear people's reflections on this, especially after, a decent part of a career with these kinds of arrangements. What has being in an area of studies, being in Black studies, and also having an association, however one is rooted or partially affiliated with the discipline, but also being a discipline worker, as so many of us are, but also an area studies worker, as so many of us are also at the same time. In other words, just how has being in Black studies and also being in history impacted your writing as an historian and as a Black Studies scholar, but also your teaching?
All these questions really involve sort of journeys, because even just the answer to that really has changed over time, I would say, like how I've seen myself, how my scholarship has changed and evolved, and likewise my teaching. It's funny. I think early on, when because I got my PhD in history and then was hired in a Department of African American Studies, 100%, my point was 100% in African American Studies. Mm-hmm. And I think it was, and this was a time when our department was very small on campus, and I think not with a lot of visibility. So I probably felt like, the historians don't really see me. Maybe they don't even know, maybe recognize me as a historian. And I think that was, a vexing thing early on. Like, how do I sort of articulate myself from this vantage point? How do I get access to working with grad students in history? We didn't have any in Black Studies then. And so that was a particular journey. So there was a time when I really wanted more engagement with them. And then, of course, our department grew. I get tenure. And of course, I have much more service to the college and to the department. And then it's like, oh, I'm so glad I'm not in this great environment, because I have enough work here. So
as a joint appointed person, that's actually a very real concern. So
yeah,
I have to say.
Exactly. So I wasn't jointly appointed. And then I got what's, like a courtesy affiliation. And so, that gave me, in some ways, a lot of freedom, kind of best of both worlds. I could work with grad students, but my service was all in African American Studies. We're now called Black Studies. We changed our name last year or the year before. So I find it now very ideal. But I think, campuses differ, and the political and social dynamics at different universities really differ. So I think there's probably a wide range of experiences, but, I really like the particular configuration of my appointment, and being in Black Studies has made me feel as a historian a lot of freedom in terms of how I want to, articulate my, what conferences I go to, where I publish, who my interlocutors are. I have to say, though, at the same time that I've always kind of felt a lot of freedom as a historian, because the methodology is very kind of wide open. It's not like we have a certain canon or great books that we must kind of always be speaking to or with or again. So I've kind of felt a lot of freedom in the methodology there already. But I think in Black Studies, it's just probably accelerated that, particularly around teaching. So, yeah.
So do you think that sense of the openness of your sort of disciplinary expectations as an historian, do you think that sense of openness is sort of that your generation of historians, or do you think that really is part of, when you're talking about working with Eric Foner and, from undergraduate through graduate, was it maybe also that, or do you really think that this is where history, maybe more than most disciplines in the humanities, has widened its scope of what counts as evidence, how you access voices, these sorts of things?
Oh, I think what's in the trunk of my car could count as evidence. I think that's always been the case. It just depends on who the historians are and what kind of questions they're interested in. But I think the notion of, I think that in other disciplines, they've used the word archive and have tried to understand it maybe to be a state archive or, a government. An archive is a kind of official, or it's governmental. Historians have never had that understanding of an archive. So an archive, I think, has been seen more as like a building, a repository. You go to the archive. But in terms of what counts as evidence or sources, it's always been very wide-ranging. And I think that Black history and the tradition of doing Black history really shows us that. It's everything from diaries and letters to film clips to comic magazines to what your grandmother told you. It's included oral history for a long time. So, I think what maybe, my own particular experience in being mentored by Eric, he was very, very capacious in terms of his approach. And I remember, again, because I was always very interested in contemporary history. So Barnard had a senior thesis requirement, and I wanted to do my senior thesis on the understanding the conservative attacks on affirmative action. And so that felt very contemporary. And so in my mind, I didn't know, was that history? And I remember going to Eric's office one day at office hours and saying, this is what I want to do. Like, is that history? Because it was very contemporary. And he sat there for a while and he listened. And he said, well, if it's yesterday, then I think it's history. So I was like, great.
I like that. It's interesting listening to you talk about this because it makes me think a lot about how the special place, like really strong place that historians have played in the history of Black studies. And maybe part of it has to do with that. I mean, myself, my PhD is in philosophy. And one of the things I will say about philosophy is the exact opposite of what you said, which is it has absolutely struggled, if not outright found it impossible to think about philosophical sources outside of, what we think of as a philosophical text, rather than being able to give philosophical readings of film clips or diaries or music. So it's the way you were talking about that more expansive, capacious notion of what evidence is and what an archive is, does make me think about the origins of the field having so many historians.
Well, I think Carter G. Woodson, right, is a good example. And like the fact that our main Black History Association, ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, is over 100 years old. So I think that generation of historians certainly understood that there was a whole archive out there, right? There was all this evidence that they could use to mobilize sort of counter arguments against imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy, right? That they had the sources and the evidence to do that. And so I think you're right. It's no accident that like history became, I think, a really important site of contesting power and a tool to use knowledge, in the struggle for in the anti-racist struggle, but the broader struggle for human freedom.
Yeah. So when you think about we're now, into the sixth decade of Black studies as an institutional discipline, which is different than the production of Black materials, of course. But when I think about the field over the last 5+ decades, when you think about it, I'm curious what you think the field has done particularly well, and also what you think it has not done particularly well. I know you shy away from the normative, but it's maybe questions that you think it's asked and answered particularly well, and questions that it hasn't maybe addressed.
I think that Black Studies has done a very good job of really taking to heart some of the innovations of Black feminism, like this idea, say, of intersectionality. And it's hard to really have this capacious approach in your scholarship that's looking at race, class, gender, sexuality, national origin, and I think that the best of our work has really tried to be very attentive to many levels of identity, many degrees of power. It's tried to bring that to our analysis of power as well as to our analysis of identity formation and subjectivity and kind of struggle. So I think that we try to be, have our eyes wide open, if you will, and be sort of brave and willing to be on the cutting edge and to take in a lot. I think having PhD programs has been really wonderful because I think our graduate students are leading us forward and are helping to, in some ways, settle a lot of earlier debates about, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, disciplinary. And I think that they've just figured out a way to just move forward and doing the best of and borrowing the tools and methods from a variety of disciplines to kind of make their work strong. So So I think our embrace of change and of the next generation to lead us, I think through these new PhD programs has been the right move and has been important. I guess I would just, this isn't really your question, but if I have a concern, it's the political environment, right? It's our future feels so precarious right now, just like we're all worrying about the state of higher education in general, because the political right is coming for us. They've been coming for us for a while. It's intensifying. It's worse in some places, particularly in the public sphere, and public universities are really under very direct congressional attack. But in K through 12, the fight against so-called CRT in K through 12, public schools across the country, but certainly worse in red states. This is dire. It's extremely concerning. And I think sometimes on our side, we're on the defensive, but I think we're trying to figure out now how to be more on the offense and how to figure out a strategy, how to protect ourselves, protect the work, the precious work that we do. So I hope and want to see more of us being on the offense and trying to kind of see really what's happening to us, politically, because they play the long game and we often are playing catch up. And I think we're going to have to embrace the long game too and figure that out. But I think it speaks to our importance, the way we've been important in the academy and in the education field writ large in the last several decades, that the right is coming for us, and allied fields, because, they know the power of education to sort of reshape the consciousness of youth in the United States. So we're the enemy now, but, we have to kind of get out there and fight back and defend our mission, because it's crucial to the future of democracy and the future of the continuing struggle to, fight a whole range of fights.
Yeah. And it's interesting just to go back to one of my first questions, which is the origins of the field. I mean, the origins of the field are origin of offense. And so it's interesting, what you're saying about, how are we going to articulate ourselves, position ourselves on the side of offense rather than always defense? I mean, everybody always has to play some form of defense, but
right.
There's a lesson, right? 1969, 1970, these founding moments are offense moments. It's strange to be taken back 50-something years, but we're being taken back 50-something years, and there is a precedent for this kind of fight.
Yeah, and I think one thing I look to is that they collaborated a lot. They were on, all these different isolated campuses around the country, but, they had lots of convenings and collaborations. And I think we're going to see more of that. That's going to become more and more necessary. I mean, we have our conferences, but I hope we're going to see greater space in these kind of already happening, conferences, academic conferences, that there's going to be room for just discussions of how we mobilize into offense and how we don't just take our jobs for granted, our work for granted, but have to think about how to have a more robust sense of helping each other when someone's under attack, when a unit's under attack or an institution. How can we mobilize to come to the aid of that individual or sector? I think it's going to be important conversations to have more and more.
And between besieged departments on our own campuses. I mean, I think one of the real challenges always this is a particularly intense moment, I think, the last 5 years, but my experience has been, all area studies departments are, sort of chronically underfunded or underhired. And so how you make solidarity in conditions of austerity, conditions of scarcity, where everybody's scrambling to have some sort of presence, have some sort of access. That's an emotional challenge, but as you say, if it's reframed by our survival and the survival of democracy, hopefully that's enough to drag us across the competitive nature, which can be a competitive framework of these austerity measures. Even in times of economic prosperity, somehow we're always in scarcity mode.
Yes. Yeah.
So let me ask then, asking you about the past and future a little bit, and here just a so conclude with two questions, but start with this one that's really about the future of Black studies and how you might imagine it or what you think its destiny is. And it's really this, it's a question that's been a question for me since I got interested in the field, which is the point of Black studies to be forever, as far as we can imagine forever be Black studies? Or is the point of Black studies to at some point not be needed? Because one of the things that I think Black studies has done really well and important work that we've done is change the sense on campuses when people are building departments and curricula that Black life matters to be taught in an English department, a history department, art department, gender studies, sociology. And so those departments, of course, build up their faculties, representing these areas. And the more it gets to be less a sort of one or two among 30, starts to become a significant portion, it makes me start to ask this question, is the destiny of Black studies eventually to erase itself and say, what we've done is transform this idea that Black life needs to be a part of what higher education is and what research is. And now the disciplines have been transformed by our very presence and our demands. Or is there something that's emerging as so distinctive about Black studies that you think it actually isn't really about sort of holding this place for the study of Black life until the disciplines catch up?
Yeah. We're not trying to work ourselves out of existence. Quite the contrary, quite the opposite. It's terrific that other disciplines are moving beyond whiteness and, seeing the need to be inclusive and comprehensive in their missions and in the teaching and scholarship that they conduct. And I think probably for some that was certainly a mission of Black studies in its early days. But I think for the vast majority of people in the field of Black studies, no, this is itself a discipline. It's a legitimate field of intellectual inquiry that hopefully will have a robust and vibrant future and a forever life. And I think a lot of departments at Black studies too embrace really a global focus and mission for their work. It's the Black world, which is an enormous, obviously, if you're just thinking of it, you can think of this as a kind of in the realm of ideas and debates and struggles, or just in terms of population, right? This is a global majority, right, that's facing dire, like we all are, right, with climate change, the climate crisis and catastrophe and global inequality growing, just urgent issues of the day that impact Black Americans, that impact the Black world. And Black studies it's an archive of critical inquiry and innovation and of ideas to address global problems, right? And global struggles and human needs. And I don't see the need for that disappearing. And no, it's as long as there's Black life and human life, we need Black studies. So that's forever and ever.
I mean, it's just my own thought, my own position as well. One of the things that, and I had said this in a previous podcast, one of the things I think is interesting is that you can find, numerous anthologies of texts, foundational texts for Black studies or course books. But one of the things that I wonder if it's time to start asking the question of is, what is distinctive about a Black studies methodology or methodologies? I mean, no discipline has a single methodology, of course, but this seems to me to be something that is central to what you just said, is that there's something distinctive about what we do. And it was interesting, you said we are a discipline, right? Having moved from an area study to a discipline. And I think that transition is really interesting to me, as it's like it's its own object of study and how to articulate that. Because, I ask myself this question. I also talk to people who are like, why is Black studies in Black studies when we have all these people, say, in the English department who do Black literature and culture? And it's like, well, there's an emerging set of methodologies that are distinctive. Maybe it's something else, like how to articulate that thing, I think is a really fascinating question.
I actually don't think there's a distinctive methodology. And I think I found that people who people who articulate that there is one, it's really their methodology that they want to claim is the discipline's method.
Yeah, that's always a problem.
So ultimately these things end up feeling exclusionary, like when we our quest and our aim to identify the methodology. I don't know. I worry a little bit about that. I think that that's an institutional dynamic that, for me, what defines it is more, it's our set of concerns. It's our shared passions and interests, the questions we ask, it's that to me is what unites it. Not so much because there are a variety of methods that get to all of these critical questions and critical concerns. So I don't see it helping us to wall off or to create a hierarchy of methods. Like, I think we have to be multilingual. We have to be conversant in a lot of methods, I think, to sort of better answer our critical questions and to produce knowledge that advances, kind of Black futures. Like, thinking of it that way, I think we need to be capacious and open and critical and rigorous. But I think it's the questions, the concerns, the passion, and the spirit that unites us.
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah. I do think the methodology question, it may be that, for me, this is not a conversation about me, but I think maybe one of the distinctivenesses of Black studies is its permissiveness around methodology, which, as we were saying before, I think history is more permissive than a lot of disciplines, but my own PhD field in philosophy, that's a very unpermissive. And so in some ways, I think the urgency of that question comes from my own sense of alienation from
It's so funny because I think of so many great philosophers who've been, so important in Black studies, I understand your point, but still, I think you can't stop people's quest and their desire, and they're going to find a way. And I should say too, I want to push back a little bit at the phrase that you're using, area studies, because there are a lot of people in ethnic studies and Black studies who really hear area studies and associate it with like a kind of a Cold War,
sure,
colonial origin, and setting up African studies and Asian studies. This was sort of to produce knowledge for, for imperial interests. So we tend to
that is not what I meant.
I know. I certainly know that was not your intention or meaning at all, but just as an FYI, we kind of, maybe we're all under the umbrella of kind of ethnic studies or identitary. I don't know. There are different ways you could articulate that umbrella, but I know many people would not embrace area studies as that umbrella term, but I know where you're coming from. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask this last question. Thinking about the, moving forward, you're in a doctoral program, and so you're teaching people who push this field forward. What do you think is the most urgent question we should be asking?
It's so hard for me to always come up with these, the most or the thing, because there's so many. Unfortunately, we're facing multiple crises. And I'm of the school of like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Like, I want people to, I think sometimes grad students or, young scholars often get negative messages, when they say, oh, I'm interested in this. And they're often told, well, no, you can't do that, or that's impossible. Like, my sense is like, listen to that voice and pursue your passion, because that's what's going to get us through. And that's what sustains us, and that's what helps us kind of strive to find the knowledge and the answers to our questions that we all kind of need. So, I'm always reluctant to say, well, this is the thing or the concern or what we need, because we need everything right now. I do think that I think people should be my advice would be, don't cloister yourselves. Like, be open-minded, be generous with your colleagues and your peers. Like, we're a team, we're a community. We have to be accountable to each other and accountable to the people we're studying about and with. And I think, it's that kind of like, have grace, have generosity, and try and, imagine your professional field as really national and international, and not just kind of in your little neck of the woods, but be as broad and open as possible?
I think that's actually an urgent question, right? That's a question to point to ourselves. And I think it's especially difficult in a moment of extreme job market anxiety, publication possibilities shrink. It's hard to get a book published. It's hard to get a job. And that level of generosity, I think, just gets more difficult in these moments. But as you say, it's also part of what drives certain crises, right? To demobilize us rather than mobilize us around, let 1,000 theses bloom.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you making the time. I mean, we're in late June. This is a time when people are on vacation and reading and, writing perhaps, or thinking about how they didn't write in the month of June. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk. And this is a super interesting conversation. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you very much. I was really happy to talk to you.
All right. Take care. Have a good rest of the day.
Okay. Bye-bye. You too.